Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. This is your host, Shreya Dale, and this is episode 2 of our new season, Fireside Chats, where we interview individuals who are passionate about history and current affairs. On today's episode, we have Kyra Dang, an incoming high school junior who is passionate about world history and international relations. Today, we will discuss the effects of colonialism on modern day society. Join us in this thrilling conversation where we discuss colonialism, independence movements, and everything in between, only on Fine Print.
Hi, I'm Kyra Dang. I'm one of the co-hosts on the podcast Half Minorities, and today I will be guest speaking in this episode about colonialism in modern day history.
Okay, welcome, Kira. So here's our first question. How has colonialism shaped modern day society, and how has it shaped the lives of first-hand immigrants and their children?
So, the colonial era was arguably the most influential era of world history. Because it fundamentally shifted global power dynamics and it had economic, political, and social consequences for colonized countries that can still be seen today. Economically, colonialism robbed countries that were rich in resources and forced them into an inescapable economic relationship with European countries, leaving them with meager resources even after gaining independence. So, in regard to political consequences, colonized countries face political instability following revolutions, forcing inhabitants to migrate in hopes of a better life for their children. So, for example, my grandparents lived during the time of French rule over Vietnam, and they were hardly tweens when the First Indochina War struck. So, following the Vietnam War and the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, my grandparents faced the hardships of living under a communist regime, including famine and sudden land reforms. Seeking a better life, they were forced to immigrate to the US, a process that took over a decade. Colonialism left a mark on thousands of families who were forced to flee their homes and immigrate to America, the UK, etc., including mine.
Yeah, and I think same kind of like what you said about your grandparents. I think these experiences really build who we are today because although you haven't firsthand experienced what your grandparents experienced, I'm sure their experiences and stories have passed down onto you and your values and your belief systems. However, I also do believe that our cultures have been largely westernized, kind of like what you said. After your grandparents migrated here, I'm sure you're living in a very different manner over here than you would have been living in if you were still in Vietnam. And this kind of westernization that we see, I see it the most in languages. So a lot of my friends and family members, they aren't able to speak their native languages in favor of English. So I think we've given English so much of a priority, which I don't think is necessarily all wrong. I think it's also important to value English. However, because of that, our own regional languages are disappearing. And for me, I think that's one of the biggest ways that colonialism has shaped modern day society.
Yeah, and colonialism, it didn't just force people to flee their homes, but it also destroyed so much of our native cultures. I mean, colonialism enforced European cultures upon natives by banning the use of native languages and destroying traditional artifacts. So, not only was European language enforced in their home countries, but we're also being taught it here in America. And it's seen as the standard, it's seen as professional, and it's basically a standard language almost globally.
Yeah, that's true. And it's not even like one of those things that was directly imposed on us. I think it was such a gradual thing that we never even realized how important English became to our day to day lives. Like in a lot of places, they kind of prioritize knowing English over knowing your regional language. They say that if you can speak, read, and write and understand English, you're suited for the job as compared to someone who can't, which I see as a complete disrespect almost of the regional language, because I think these languages, they have the power to tell us so much about where someone comes from and what their traditions are and what their history is. English can convey your emotions to a certain point, but you can't always convey how you truly feel about your culture and where you come from if you're not speaking in that regional language.
Yeah, and this also reflects the experience of so many immigrant children. They feel like they aren't cultured enough to the point where they can fit in with their natives in their homeland, but they also feel like they're too cultured and not westernized enough to fit in with their more Americanized slash westernized peers in America.
For sure. There's that kind of sense of being lost. Like, I know we've had the lost generation in the past. I truly feel like we are also a part of that lost generation in a different sense. Kind of like what you said, you don't feel like you really belong to one culture as opposed to the other. And I think another way I see colonialism kind of shaping modern day society is through colorism. So
Mm.
in India, my parents, when they were growing up, it's not as prevalent anymore, of course, but there was this cream. It was called Fair and Lovely. And there was this image in the ad. What they showed was that this girl had dark skin and she applied the cream every day for like 5 or 6 days or so. At the end of the 5 or 6 days, her color was like completely white. And I'm sure you can't get to that color. That was completely faked. But that just kind of set this unrealistic beauty standard, almost saying that if you're not fair, you're not beautiful. And we kind of started to model what true beauty is based on how the Europeans looked. And I just think that's erased our native culture. I mean, Indians have had historically darker skin because we've been out in the sun more. And I think that truly reflects our values of hard work. And I'm sure it's the same for you back home in Vietnam. I don't know if you've had the same experiences.
Yes, I actually did take notes about colorism and Eurocentric beauty standards when I was doing a little research for this episode. Colorism is definitely still prevalent in our generations back in our native countries because although in the West it's seen as dark skin is more valuable, a lot of people in the West don't understand what it's like to live in your native countries and have this disconnect. Like, you don't feel like you can fit into either beauty standards because the beauty standards are completely different in Asia and in virtually almost every other part of the world, like in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. Those are all colonized areas, and in all of those areas, Eurocentric features are desired. They are seen as the beauty standard, and it's as if being white somehow makes you superior or somehow makes you more worthy. And you can definitely see that in the entertainment industry still. And although I do agree that it's not as severe as it was in our parents' generation, it still definitely exists in bias.
Definitely. And now it's more indirect than it ever was. Like kind of what you said with the entertainment industry. I know we were talking about this a while ago about the film Moana and how you mentioned that instead of using native actors and actresses that could accurately represent that culture, you said that they were favoring more European looking actresses and actors as if that was making them look more beautiful and desirable to watch on screen, which is
Mhm.
it's just completely unrealistic. It's not accurately depicting how those people looked, how they behaved. I mean, a European actor or actress, to some extent, they could learn the culture, but the way they truly feel couldn't be represented any better than if you had a native actor or actress there.
Mhm. And yes, there are people that naturally have more European features. We're not saying that those people don't exist, but the majority of people in these countries don't look like that. That's only the beauty standard because, for one, colonialism imposed values that being seen as close to European as possible was desired because that gave you more privileges, and then that in turn became a beauty standard. But really, our native features, they reflect what our ancestors went through. Like, all of these features are biological for a reason. Like, the reason why Europeans have taller noses are because they had to have smaller nostrils because they lived in colder regions. The reasons why Africans and a lot of Southeast Asians have flatter noses is because they lived in more humid areas where they needed nostrils that were wide in order to breathe through the humid air. And by trying to adjust ourselves to fit into these Eurocentric beauty standards, we erase our true origins.
Definitely. And I think there was this quote I came across a few days ago where it said that what you are and how you look like today is just centuries and centuries of love. And I just think that's such a beautiful quote. And by trying to erase how we look, it's not only getting rid of the love that our parents, our grandparents have showered on us by instilling their cultures and roots, kind of like what you said, it almost erases that culture that we've come holding from the past. Like you said, I'm from South Asia and you're from Southeast Asia. We have very similar climates, which is why we have different features than Europeans. And I think that's a matter of pride. I think because our people were farmers or they used to grow rice, they were outside a lot, which is why they developed differently as compared to Europeans, who actually had slaves doing work for them. So,
Mm-hmm.
if anything, we should be proud of what we have because it's based on our hard work. And not only that, I just wanted to bring up another example of the film industry in India. So, for those of you who don't know, Bollywood is the Hindi film industry in India. And there's been a lot of talks about how we portray poor characters in comparison to rich characters.
Mm-hmm.
The way they show rich characters in films, almost 99% of the time, they have light skin, they have very Western features, which is prevalent in North India. And every time they show a poor character, they have slightly darker skin, they have more dust covering their face, they're slightly more untamed almost. I
Mm-hmm.
just think that's such a bad and such a weak representation of who we are. And I know it's not just Bollywood. It's in the streets of so many colonized countries where if we see someone wearing a suit and a tie and if someone just has like gelled hair, we automatically think, "Oh, they're more professional, they're more approachable."
Mm-hmm.
If we see someone on the streets wearing like raggedy clothes, what are we gonna think? We're gonna think, oh, this person's not approachable. But who's truly reflecting that regional culture? I would say it's the second person, not the first. And just these unrealistic beauty standards that we were talking about, I just think that just keeps reiterating it.
Yeah, and this whole aspect of professionalism and how it relates to native cultural aspects and clothing and attire reminds me of this passage that I read in English last year. It was about this Muslim couple that moved to Canada recently, and to get a job, they were forced with the ultimatum of removing parts of their native headwear and their native attire and preferring more Western business attire in order to get this corporate job. And that just reflects how professionalism has found a way to discriminate against cultural aspects in attire. Because really, what you wear and how your hair looks doesn't impact how professional or how skilled or how capable you are in reality. But it's seen as a standard, which is almost a way that our world today still discriminates against ethnic cultures.
100%. I totally agree with you on that. And just because someone comes walking in with a suit and a tie doesn't make them any more knowledgeable or any more kind hearted or any more able for a job than someone who came wearing their regional attire. If anything, if I was the one hiring out of the two of them, I would pick the one who came wearing their regional culture because that just shows me that they're proud of who they are and they're proud of their ancestry and they don't feel the need to wear an expensive suit or a tie to show me who they really are on the inside.
Mm-hmm. This is a little bit off topic, but I wanted to circle back on the aspect of language and how so many people in so many immigrant children in America or other Western countries don't know a lot of their native languages, not just because they are physically distant from their native countries, but also because of how their native cultures were destroyed. And a lot of this has formed a type of embarrassment or shame for our native cultures through systems in America, which may not be intended for that, but definitely cause the effect where other cultures are othered and Americanization is seen as the standard.
Definitely. And now, especially whenever I speak to my grandparents, I'll always be speaking to them in Marathi, which is our regional language. And
Mhm.
although they can speak English, you just can't convey the same emotion and the same feelings that you have for each other. Even if you, for example, sometimes my grandma tells me and my brother stories that she got from her parents and they got from their parents. She could convey the same stories in English, but they wouldn't be conveyed with the same emotion if they weren't conveyed in the language that they were meant to be conveyed in. And language, I mean, language is just a mode of expression. And I don't think it matters what language you speak for someone to judge how developed you are or how modernized you are.
Yeah, and like how English is enforced in the workplace and in school so much, it almost seems like they're claiming it as superior. And there's no shame in knowing several languages. That's something you should be proud of. You should be proud of knowing several different cultures and knowing several different language. That's something that other people are envious of. But a lot of the time, when people don't know their native cultures as well as they should, or they believe they should, we blame ourselves for not taking our own initiative to learn about our native cultures, or our parents for not teaching us to learn about it. But really, Western society is to blame for teaching us to be almost embarrassed of our native cultures and languages as if it's inferior or not useful.
Definitely. And I think they're erasing such an important part of what makes us truly unique. I mean, if everyone went around only speaking English, I think we'd lose so much of what history has to offer. And I just think that's 100% wrong. And I think each of us, we kind of have a duty, even if society around us kind of demotes it. I think we should all maybe spend 5 minutes out of your day, just read something about your language or your culture, whatever you find interesting, and make a conscious effort to kind of promote that in a society that otherwise demotes it. I think that's the least we can do, especially both of us being children of immigrants. I do think that we have a responsibility to ensure that our culture isn't being forgotten.
Mhm.
Okay, so now for our second question. Do you think Gen Z immigrant children still feel the effects of colonialism or not?
So, like I said before, I definitely feel like Gen Z children of immigrants are still being affected by colonialism, as is everyone. I mean, colonialism, like I said before, destroyed thousands of years of indigenous cultures. Like colonizers banned the use of native languages and destroyed traditional artifacts. And on top of that, citizens of colonized countries were forced to flee due to political instability, armed conflict, or economic collapse, which could be attributed to colonialism. And like I said again, today so much of our generation is disconnected from their native culture because of these reasons. And yeah, this is a theme that I feel like really resonates with me personally because although I understand Vietnamese, I really don't get that many opportunities to speak it, even at home, since speaking English is so customary.
Yes, for sure. And I think because we don't get the opportunity to really use it living in the US, if you were living in Vietnam today, I'm sure English wouldn't be as much of a priority as Vietnamese would be. However, because we're living outside of our countries, it's very easy to forget that stuff. And I do think it's also wrong to blame children. It's just the way our society has kind of trained us to be, almost to where we feel embarrassed of our own culture and our own language. One of the other ways I think we're getting affected by colonialism is kind of through our names. I don't know if you've had this experience, but
Mm.
when my parents were naming me, one of their key concerns was, could an American pronounce it? And I just think that's something. It's just sad that they even had to think about that, because what the problem is if we do name our children something that is a little hard for someone here to pronounce, even though they'll take an effort. I mean, I know we have, whenever there's a substitute teacher and they don't know our name, they
Mhm.
always start with the line, bear with me and correct me if I say your name wrong. And I think we're also fed up with correcting them that we eventually just go with the Western pronunciation of our
Mhm.
name. And it's such a small thing, but it's slowly erasing who we truly are. Because at the end of the day, your name is a big part of your identity. And
Mhm.
for someone to mispronounce that, I do think that's disrespectful, even though they're not doing it intentionally, of course.
Yeah, and this is the reason why so many immigrant children have their native names and they also have English names. Like, I go by my English name just because nobody calls me by my Vietnamese name, but a lot of people have middle names that are their ethnic names, and I feel like it would do all of us so much of a service if we all went by our cultural names because it gives us insight into who we are. It has a meaning in our native
Definitely.
cultural languages.
Yeah, and especially for, I know for South Asians, even for Southeast Asians, our names have either historical roots, religious roots, or cultural roots. If they don't have any of those, they just have a really beautiful meaning. And for that to get forgotten to Western culture and more Americanized names, in our example, I think that's one of the many ways that our cultures are being erased. And I think it's our duty to, it's as small as correcting the teacher respectfully and saying, here, this is how you pronounce my name. And I'm sure they'd love to correct themselves because now they're also learning about your culture. But for us to say, oh, yeah, just call me that, this is my nickname, we're also kind of disrespecting our own name and in turn our own culture.
Yeah, and our names are some of the only ways that immigrant children who don't speak their own language or don't get to experience their own culture every day can hold on to their culture. Or, like another example, food. A lot of the time, ethnic foods are being westernized, and that's a really concerning trend for me.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the examples I had was there's something that in India we call it haldi doodh, and haldi is turmeric and doodh is milk. But what Americans or even Europeans what they say is turmeric lattes, and it's the exact same thing. Haldi doodh and turmeric lattes, they're the exact same thing. But the difference is you drink one from an earthen pot made of clay and you drink one from a Starbucks cup of coffee. And that just makes people feel special saying, oh, I'm drinking a turmeric chai latte. Well, first of all, chai and tea are the same thing. And second of all, you're drinking what we have used as a medical remedy ever since the Indus Valley civilization. And that's just an example I had. I know literally every colonized country has examples where Europeans have taken their cultures, kind of warped it into their own, and now it's presented as a very posh and fancy and, connecting with their culture type of thing. When in reality, it's just our forgotten history.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that the British national food is like chicken tikka masala or something. Like, are we being serious right now?
I know, right? Like chicken tikka masala. The second word of Britain's national food comes
Yeah.
from a different country. Like, please explain that to me. I was expecting like fish and chips or something.
Right. And by westernizing ethnic foods, we diminish one of the few resources that immigrant children still have to learn about their culture. Like, even if immigrant children aren't speaking their native language every day, they still consume the flavors of their traditional cuisine. So, I feel like the solution to this is pretty simple. If you see a cultural food or any other piece of culture online and you want to recreate it, take the time to do basic research on its cultural history and acknowledge its origins in your recreation. And understandably, if you do think you're creating something original, but someone else points out that this already exists in another culture, take time to go back and acknowledge its existence.
Definitely. And don't feel embarrassed that someone pointed you out. Don't feel like you're being attacked. I would take it as a learning opportunity because if that person didn't come up to you and they didn't tell you that, hey, this is actually from here, not from here, it's just helping you learn more. I mean, what more is it doing but giving you the correct answer to something you were previously misunderstanding?
Mhm.
Okay, and for our last question today, do you think our school systems accurately teach colonialism?
So I think our schools do a decent job with the resources they're given. AP courses such as World History AP allow students to learn about the colonial histories of several African, Latin American, and Southeast Asian countries, as well as piquing students' interest in these topics. However, I do understand that the curriculum is very basic and doesn't get the chance to really deconstruct the scale of atrocities and lasting effects of colonialism. I mean, in this case, I'd love to see more classes which would be able to go even further in depth on these topics being offered, but I think in general, our school systems give us the necessary tools by encouraging analytical thinking and providing us with more general knowledge to individually learn about colonialism.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I know we both took AP World History, and we both might have shared experiences about how our cultures weren't accurately reflected in the school curriculum.
Mhm.
And it's not the teacher's fault because they're handed a curriculum and their job is to prepare us for an exam. But by making history a subject that's just being taught for the sake of teaching it and for the sake of a grade, I think that's truly diminishing the value that it has. So, for example, from WAP, I remember we covered Vietnam for 2 days, probably. I think I'm being generous. It might have been one and a half. And let me tell you, all I can remember about what we learned about Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh was communist. I remember one side was a communist country, one side was a capitalist country,
Mhm.
and that they were ruled by France. And eventually, we kind of spoiled them economically to where they're doomed now. And I'm sure if anyone goes to Vietnam, they're gonna say, no, people here are living fine. People here are happy to be here. The way we portray them in the history books, it sounds like they're almost suffering because they're lower beings than the Europeans. And I
Mhm.
think that's a mistake our school system makes, not just with Vietnam, even in the example of India. I'm going to mention India because I'm from India,
Mhm.
and they portray the caste system as one of the only things that we had to offer. We never cover who invented the number zero, which was actually an Indian thinker. Without the number zero, we wouldn't even have computers today. However, all that people know about India is the caste system, and if you took another stretch, was our practice of sati, which is where if the husband dies, the woman has to sit in the burning pyre of ashes with her husband. And what's being taught in the history books is that when the British colonized India, they felt bad about the practice and they abolished it. However, the true story was that there was an Indian activist who actually abolished it, and what that's just another example of making us think that the Indians were somehow backward in their thought. Like
Mhm.
with periods, for example. A lot of people think that Indians are very taboo about the topic, which in many rural households it is the case, I will agree. However, there was a time in Indian history, specifically in the Maratha Empire, the reason they used to tell women to go into a different room and not cook and not clean, it wasn't because they considered women impure. It was actually because they recognized that women were in pain during their periods, and it was to give them rest and it was to honor them for what they were doing.
Mhm.
So, but the way we learn it in the history books is that India was a backward thinking country who thought that women are impure when they're on their periods. And I thought that for so long until my mom actually told me about this, which I think it's so messed up that what we learn is actually not the case most of the time.
Mhm. Yeah, and the way that some of these history classes teach only the quote unquote bad aspects of our native cultures in Europeans' eyes, it almost creates this form of modern day colonialism. And it reinforces this standard that Europeans were greater and that they had this white savior complex when they came and they colonized these countries, which is completely wrong, first of all. And another thing I'd like to point out about our history classes is the fact that mainly European countries are covered, like in World History AP. You mentioned how maybe there were 1.5 days to talk about Vietnam. I can't even list how many days we spent talking on Britain or on France or on America, because simply there was just more focus on it. And that doesn't mean that Asian, Southeast Asian, African, or Latin American countries had less rich, diverse, and complex histories. It just meant that there was more discussion over these European countries. And there's even a class for European history, AP Euro. But there aren't even classes that are offered for other colonized areas like Asia or Africa or Latin America.
For sure, yeah. And whenever I talk to people about this thing that you're mentioning about world history, a class that's based on world history being almost 80 to 90% about Europe, their number one answer is, well, the world wouldn't be as we know it without Europe. And I just think that answer is it kind of blows my mind because that means you're kind of disregarding everything that those countries built off of before the Europeans. I mean, let's talk about the Aztecs and the way they designed their cities. I mean, I'm sure the Europeans, they didn't know that there was such advanced architecture going on in the Americas. However, what we say is that if the Europeans hadn't come there, if Spain hadn't come there, they would be nothing but a pile of ashes. We are discrediting the knowledge that they possessed, and we're discrediting the immense history that they had to share with us. And I'm going to be completely honest. I would rather study history where you didn't mention Europe at all, because that way I would actually get to see how each country developed on their own. I would get to see how their religions influenced the way they developed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so much more valuable for today's world, where a lot of the times, I mean, we're having so many disputes over religion and countries and nationalities. And for each of us to even know a little bit about these places in the world, I just think that also makes for more educated students as opposed to us just learning about Anglicanized countries. You know, like when the British came to India, they changed the names of a lot of cities because it was hard for them to pronounce.
Mm-hmm.
Until date, people living in those cities don't know that the name that they go by is actually an Anglicanized version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this happened with so many African countries too. I mean, I feel like the solution to this would be to implement more classes based on these other regions individually. And I understand that some schools may not have the resources or the teachers qualified to teach these courses, but I feel like big corporations like College Board definitely have the resources to at least create these curriculums in the first place and allow these classes to be taken, whether individually or given at schools where they do have the resources to teach them. And I'm sure a lot of students would be glad to learn about these topics.
No, for sure. And I can actually tell that some of our history teachers in our school, they would love to expand. However, they're under a time crunch and they're only given select materials that they can talk about. A lot of the times what happens is certain materials are almost banned because they're too controversial. And I think that's where the true history lies. Because if something is too controversial to be spoken about, that means there was something in there that has the power to change the way you think. And the fact that so many of us don't know what real history is, it's just crazy in my opinion.
Yeah, and the fact that so many kids in different countries are taught individual versions of history according to their country's historical narratives is so insane to me, because we need to be taught an even history, an unbiased history, because things that are controversial are arguably the most important things to talk about. I mean, we have to talk about the controversies of the past in order to really dissect today's society and impose those lessons that we learned from controversial topics in the past in order to better our society today.
For sure, yeah. No, I totally agree with what you're saying. And it's kind of like there was this one trial in this American public school. It was called the Scopes Monkey Trial. And what they were arguing on is whether or not to teach evolution in schools. And at that time, that was a very touchy topic because religious conservatives, they believed that you shouldn't be teaching that because that's wrong. Saying that we evolved from apes didn't fit in the religious category. However, what more educated people, what they believed was that it should be taught because that's science. And it's things like this that really open your eyes to how much our education system has been covered up to only show us the nice and the sweet and the peaceful parts of history. Like, I'm sure we talk bad about the Germans whenever we're learning about the Holocaust. But I want to know what a German student learns about the Holocaust. I mean, do they portray the country as negatively as we do when it comes to the Holocaust? Or do they kind of still give them a bit of leeway and say, we did that, but we've learned from our mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're gonna start the rapid fire round. So here's the first question. Divide and rule or loot and leave? Which was the more effective British strategy?
I'd say divide and rule. The British gradually exerted power and took control over several countries' governments, and that allowed them to ultimately exploit countries in the way that they did. Like, for example, India and the British East India Company.
Okay, spices or tea? Which would you have come to Asia for?
Spices. I can't imagine eating my food with just salt and pepper.
Definitely, yeah, same. Okay, do you think that countries that were colonized in the past can ever surpass the economic success of their colonizers?
Well, that's a hard question. It depends on so many factors other than simply colonizer or colonized, although that did make a big impact. I mean, for example, the US was formerly colonized by Britain, but I think that the extent to which the colonizer had control over the country and modern economic relationships definitely make a big difference. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, though.
Okay, what is the most interesting takeaway from your world history class?
I'd have to say gunpowder. Before WAP, I really didn't realize how big gunpowder made a difference in global power dynamics.
Okay, how would you explain colonialism to a child?
Okay. Imagine you're playing a game and a hacker joins your server and the hacker takes all of your resources for themselves and they destroy everything you had built in the game.
It's a very depressing example.
I mean, colonialism was pretty depressing.
Okay, if you could travel to one colonized country of the past, where would you go and why?
I mean, I'd have to say I'd go to my mother country, which is Vietnam. I mean, getting to experience the past would be like a life-changing and eye-opening experience for me, and I'd finally get to truly experience my culture firsthand. I want to understand how colonization affected my culture personally, and how I can reclaim aspects of my own native culture.
Okay, I agree, and I think going there and experiencing it for yourself is definitely a whole new, it just gives you a whole new perspective. Okay, if you could make a Netflix series about what we talked about today, what would it be called and what does it cover?
Um, it would be called something like Echoes of Colonialism or Echoes of Empire, and it would follow the lives of immigrant families, for example, Vietnamese, Indian, Native American, etc., and it would give firsthand accounts on how colonialism affected their families' countries and how they unlearned colonial narratives and reconnected with their native histories and cultures.
Okay. Okay, now for the last section of today's episode, you're gonna build your own historical figure based on the given situation. Are you ready?
Okay.
Okay, so you're the leader of a small country that is currently facing a population influx. Nearby countries are drowning or have drowned, and the surviving people are rushing into your country. Because of the sudden rush of immigrants, there are no background checks being done, which means criminals might also be infiltrating the country.
Oh,
It is
wow.
up to you to handle this population influx. Resources are running out fast. So, the first question for you is, what region would you want this problem to be in?
Okay, I know I spent this whole episode kind of like dogging on Europe, but I would have to say Europe.
I mean, there's a lot of water around. Just escape if it gets bad.
Right.
Okay, what personality would you want? An innovator, a scientist, a human rights activist, an artist, a politician, or a warrior?
I'd say human rights activists, definitely. You have to sympathize with the people coming into our country.
Okay. Whose calmness would you want? Martin Luther King Jr., George Washington, Simone Bolivar, Indira Gandhi, or Abraham Lincoln?
Um, I'll say MLK Jr.
It's pretty valid. I mean, the way he handled the situation that was being put in front of him, I think he would be perfect for this situation as well.
Mhm.
Okay, whose wisdom would you want? Marie Curie, Aristotle, Nelson Mandela, APJ Abdul Kalam, or Ho Chi Minh?
Um, Nelson Mandela.
Okay. And lastly, whose charisma would you want? Princess Diana, Jawaharlal Nehru, or Malcolm X?
Princess Diana.
Okay. I like your historical figure. Do you think they'd handle this situation well?
I mean, I think with the calmness of MLK Jr. and like the wisdom and of Nelson Mandela and the charisma of Princess Diana, they are already like a pretty popular figure and they could convince their citizens to follow what they would have to say, I guess.
Definitely. Okay, so that's it for the episode today. How was it for you?
Great. I really liked this experience in which I got to unpack how colonialism affected not only my country, but also India, your country. And I just learning and really taking the time to deconstruct how colonialism still affects us today was a very needed conversation for me.
Definitely. And I enjoyed speaking to you about colonialism as well, especially because we both are immigrants. I think we bring our own perspectives and experiences to the table. I learned a lot about your experiences, and it was really nice talking to you. All right, everyone, and that's a wrap on episode 2 of the Fireside Chats with our guest, Kyra Dang. Today, we spoke extensively about how colonialism has affected modern day society and continues to shape the lives of many, even today. Keep following us on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you're listening from, and follow us on Instagram at fineprint.pod to get the latest updates on new episodes and series. Until then, keep reading between the lines.